So again, this session is being recorded. Appreciate everybody jumping on. And again, this is the session number 3, ransomware data exfiltration that we're covering today. So, and one of the things I wanted to cover just real quick was, again, recap our session 1 and 2 real quickly. So in session 1 and 2, session 1, we kind of laid the groundwork for what was occurring from a ransomware perspective and how COVID, quite honestly, and remote working was a catalyst, unfortunately, for an increase in ransomware attacks. And due to that increase, the effects that that was having on the cyber insurance industry, and therefore organizations aligning themselves with cyber insurance. And in session 2, we talked a little bit about assessments and how the insurance indemnifiers are working to help customers or organizations with assessments to help, focus on mitigating their controls, et cetera, and things that you can do, how you can leverage your software vendors in order to help you with those assessments, and just kind of a few best practices. And now we move into the specifics around the double-sided threat, extortion threat from ransomware. And again, there's 2 primary methods they use for extortion. And one is they will exfiltrate data. They will copy data out of your environment into their own environment. And that can be for a multitude of reasons, but of course, mostly, as we know with ransomware attackers, it's financial, and they can offer that information up for sale on the dark web, and either you can choose to buy it back, or they can sell it to somebody else that's bidding for that information, that depending upon, of course, what they find, et cetera. So, and the data exfiltration piece is the piece we'll be talking about today. Tomorrow in our final session, we will be talking about availability and how after they've exfiltrated data out of your environment, how they will work to make your systems unavailable, attack your backups and things like that. Just as an FYI, tomorrow we will have Bridget back with us. She's been very gracious to help us on these sessions. So Bridget with Booz Allen will be back with us tomorrow. We actually have a special guest speaker, which is Nick Simpson from Gartner. He has written several papers on backup and availability and the increased attack vectors they're seeing, et cetera. So Nick will open and close the session for us tomorrow with Gartner. So we're very gracious, very grateful that Nick is taking time to do that for us tomorrow. And in addition to that, we'll have NetFoundry and Veeam, and as well as Oracle participating in this session as well tomorrow. So it'll be a packed session again tomorrow. But so that's going to be for session 4. But again, going back to today, we have our panelists with us. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order on the organizations here. So Bridget, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself again to our attendees.
I'm Bridget Quinn Choi. I am a director of incident response at Booz Allen. I started my career as an attorney in New York City. I then pivoted in-house to an insurance company where they started running this interesting new product called Cyber. And since that time, I've dedicated myself to cyber practice. After my career in insurance, I started as general counsel and managing director of strategy and incident DFIR, Digital Forensics Incident Response Company. And about 9 months ago, Booz Allen called me and asked me to lead their market strategy for their incident response team, and here I rest.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Bridget. Appreciate it. And Rachel, we'll go to you next. If you don't mind introducing yourself to everybody and what you do there at Marsh.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Rachel Lavender. I sit here in Washington, D.C. I'm a senior vice president in our national cyber practice here in US and Canada. I lead a team of about 10 or 12 people here. And our goal is really, we're focused on the placement of the policy. We really are acting as the advocate for our clients, for some of you perhaps. And we negotiate directly with the insurance companies, but we are not an agent of the insurance company. I want to clarify that. We are the broker. Our relationship is with you, the insured, and we act on your behalf. Before that, since Bridget was kind enough to give her background, I'm actually a recovering accountant. I've been in insurance for 17 years and I'm still recovering. I did accounting for 10 years, but I will say it was an excellent training ground for how to handle the landscape that we find ourselves in today, much of which we end up helping our clients with forensic investigations. And so I tend to run back home to my accounting days and the lessons learned there around process and protocols and having rules. So that's what we're here today to talk about. And I know we're going to be talking about some of the controls that we in the insurance community and people like Bridget and others on the call are probably saying this is what companies need to implement to better protect themselves.
Yeah, exactly. No, thank you for that, Rachel. By the way, I'm a recovering accountant as well. So I can relate. And just FYI, Bridget's out of New York City and Rachel is out of Washington, DC, and really close to the Capitol, by the way. I was surprised. So Rachel's out of DC. And next we're going to hop across the pond to Philip with NetFoundry. So Philip, please introduce yourself and what you do there at NetFoundry.
Thanks, Ted. So yeah, I'm based in Cambridge, but UK, not Massachusetts. My role is looking after global business development for NetFoundry. So, managing our Oracle relationship, working with our largest partners, finding cool and cutting edge use cases that we can help customers to resolve cyber problems with. Excellent.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us. I know it's dinner time for y'all there. So, so the good thing is a lot of people here are eating lunch and, I know you just finished dinner, so it's good to have you. So, and next is Russ Lowenthal with Oracle. So Russ, I know you're up in New York as well today. So please introduce yourself and what you do at Oracle.
Thanks, Ted. I'm Russ Lowenthal. I manage the database security pieces of the Oracle database. So authentication, authorization, encryption, really anything that has to do with this database. Been here at Oracle for 23 years. Prior to that, Department of Defense for another 22 years. And I am taking this call from a farmhouse that was built in 1749. So for Philip, that's new construction, but for those of us in the US, that's old.
Yeah, exactly. That is new especially for Cambridge. Exactly. So, so no, great to have you. And I have to tell you, it looked quite a bit warmer, Russ, on the last session where we were sitting out at the park.
It's so cold.
Exactly. All right. Well, let's kick this off. And again, appreciate everybody joining with us today. This is a live interactive panel discussion, as you can tell. And so really glad to have everybody with us. So Rachel, I'm going to start with you. I know, as you mentioned, y'all work on behalf of customers, and as one of the leading insurance brokers, I know you've contributed to and you've had a couple of podcasts, et cetera, around a focused set of controls to assist customers, specifically to ransomware. And I wanted to see if maybe you could speak a little bit about those specific control areas. I know you have a 12 total, and then 5 that are prioritized within that by Marsh. And I wanted to see if maybe you could speak to us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think to sort of understand the landscape that we find all of ourselves in, you first have to say, whoa, baby, how far we've come. I mean, when cyber insurance was first sort of came on the scene, it was sort of created back in the late 90s. I think the first product was issued by AIG in 1996. And actually, Bob Parisi, who's a former colleague of mine, he's now at Munich Re. He was one of the brain children behind that product. And you know, at that time, it was this fledgling. I call cyber the tweener of insurance. Like, insurance is this old clunky. You know, you got property, you have casualty, you have auto, work comp, you have bond and surety. But cyber, it's growing. It has pains. It's got warts. It's got acne. It has a fit and falls in it. And mainly that's because it's untested until recently. And so what you find is a lot of companies were writing these insurance products, and we sort of knew, okay, these are some controls that every company should have in place. But we didn't have a good body of losses outside of the big mega breaches that we've all gotten notices in the mail about. We didn't really know what the full benefit of the policy was. Like, there were these coverages like business interruption and contingent business interruption and ransom payments. Wow, really? You can get a ransom payment? You know, so it's like there are all these coverages that were really not tested at all. And so then the pandemic happened. Well, actually, it started in 2017. And you had this thing over in Europe. And those of us in America were like, want to cry, not pet you, not my problem, right? So, but there were some early days there. So there were some indications of, oof, because a lot of that had to do with patch management. A lot of it had to do with these open platforms. A lot of it had to do with sort of login and user access. And there were some really basic fundamental things that companies weren't doing, but we were like, not my problem. I don't have to worry about it yet. Well, when we all went home to start working last year, it became our problem. Because the bad actors, I'm just going to call them the bad actors, all they had to do was walk down the cyber alleyway. I compare cyberspace to sort of like when you walk down an alley behind a bunch of houses. You can look in any of those houses. You can look in the windows, you can look in the doors, and you can determine whether or not, their door's open. I'm going to walk right through there. That's exactly what some of the cyber criminals are doing, is they're perusing through cyberspace to see how can I get in. And that's exactly what they did at the beginning of last year when we all started working from home, is a lot of companies had these open platforms, and there really weren't even any speed bumps to slow people down from going in. And once they got into the environment, they moved around. So what are some lessons we've learned? You've all been wondering, when is she going to get to the punchline? So the lessons learned there are 12. I'm not going to go through all 12 of them, but I will talk about a few of the critical controls that we, the insurance world, and probably most security professionals think are the single most important controls you can have in place. And the number one correlating factor we found, number one correlating control we found at helping prevent and mitigate loss is multi-factor authentication. There is no question that all of our usernames and passwords are out there. I don't care how complicated your password is, if it's 26 characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols, that is already been stolen by someone. Or if they're already on your system, they've already been able to grab your password. But if you have multi-factor authentication, being a separate authentication that it really is me logging into the system, that's the best way to prevent, so that if my credentials are stolen, I have MFA to sort. Multi-factor, meaning MFA is the acronym. That's your biggest protection. And any insurance company that you work with, if you don't have MFA, we are going to face significant hurdles to getting you coverage. I'm not even talking about price now. I'm not talking about how much limit, just whether or not I can place a policy for you. The insurance community has said we are not going to place policies for companies that have no MFA. They just won't, because it's every time they do, that's the company that gets hacked. So that's the single most important one. There are some others around endpoint detection and response. which is a tool that effectively gives you the opportunity to detect when the bad actors are on the system. And then there's privileged access management. This is a pretty significant, important one in terms of managing just what it says. Those who have privileges and access to a larger scope of the system, you need to have a better control of that. I will say, of the three, Pam, privileged access management, she's an expensive lady. She costs quite a bit of money to implement. So if you're trying to prioritize between the three, I'd probably start with MFA, multi-factor authentication, then endpoint detection and response, EDR, and then go down the expensive PAM path because she likes a big diamond ring. So, those are the top three. There are some low-hanging fruit ones that you can do as well, though. Having a good old-fashioned incident response plan can do wonders for you. Just knowing what you're supposed to do, who you're going to call, who are the 5 people on your crisis management team that need to be involved when there is a breach. Having something like that, having a framework. Because what I can tell you is when you have one of these attacks, your hair is on fire. You have no ability to think rationally. So to the degree that you have a roadmap of at least telling you what you should do in those early hours can be incredibly important. Pause in case there are questions.
No, that's very helpful, Rachel. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to jump over to Bridget. I'll jump over to you real quick because I know they're at Booz Allen. Y'all help a lot of customers, and we've talked a little bit about that. But so maybe you can provide some insight. How are the advisors assisting customers, especially around data exfiltration, where data is being copied out of their environment, et cetera? Can you provide us some insight on what the advisors are what they're doing to assist customers with that?
Well, almost every ransomware attack these days will have a threat of data exfil. A couple of things we know about data exfil, and it's evolving. So while it's mostly true today, tomorrow they might change. So keep that in mind. But they mostly don't know what they have. And mostly what they will tell you when they say, hi, we've ransomed your system, everything's encrypted, also we stole data, you have 72 hours to pay us. The threat of data exfil only really works if they have something valuable. So they'll say something along the lines of, we know you do work with Apple. We have, X terabytes worth of data. It's going to be bad for you. We're going to sell the information. We're going to post it on the dark web, et cetera, et cetera. What we advise in these situations is a couple of things. One, the primary goal of any attacker, ransomware attacker, is generally they want money. They don't want your information. There's not a lot of money in reselling it. And their sole focus is getting you to pay. So the data itself isn't necessarily something they want. On the other hand, as soon as that data leaves your system and is in their hands, paying for that data or paying for suppression of that data really has no protection value, because it's already been compromised. So we typically say, listen, you only pay as a last resort. If you can't get your systems back up, it's so rare that there's value in paying for data suppression. And going back to what we discussed before, having an IR plan, having a plan that anticipates these things, because we know how these guys act, and knowing how you're going to respond with this scenario, having the pressure and almost a duress-like situation, forcing you to want to pay, forcing you to think that the only option is to pay, and understanding logically that they have your information, they really don't know the value. Some of them might sift through and find, for example, an insurance policy. Their sole goal is not to take your information. Their sole goal is to get money. So we shouldn't panic. But we should know that the information is already compromised. There is no mitigation that can happen because bad guys have access to information. The only thing we can offer is some sort of forensic review of what was taken, so you mitigate whatever private information or protected information was taken. So that's the context I would give you, and those are the scenarios we deal in and day out.
Yeah, and I think, Bridget, to that point, I know you and Heather on the last webinar session, y'all mentioned that to talk about how they access the data, the majority of the ransomware demands are in alignment with the indemnification amount, right, of the policy.
I wouldn't say majority. I think typically what they do, and it could happen two ways. They typically take whatever, it's a smash and grab. So think of ransomware like, okay, we got access to the store. We know the alarm's going to go off in 20 minutes. I'm going to take whatever I could get. When they send it back to us, it's in very unformatted format. They never get, sometimes they give us back someone else's information, right? So these are not, while they're sophisticated, they're not super organized, because they're also handling 6 or 7, if not more, at any one time. What typically they do is they'll go into Active Directory or some sort of search function when they're moving laterally and just put in insurance policy or cyber, and then they'll see it and they'll take it. So lesson learned, make sure you're not leaving your cyber policy free for anyone to access in your system. And you probably won't have that happen to you, but it happened. I would say it's happened to us maybe 2 or 3 times. It's not necessarily instructive that you have to pay to the limits of liability. It's just another duress pressure tactic that they're using to get a really high payment.
Yeah, no, that's good point. So so I know, I'll move on, Russ, I'll move on to you. I know Rachel talked about multi-factor authentication, privileged access controls, and then of course we're talking about data exfiltration, the copying of information. So Russ, from your perspective, maybe you can comment on those, and especially why customers should focus on their databases as a primary target for these attackers.
Thanks, Ted. I think both Rachel and Bridget have kind of pointed out that the motivation is financial, right? And so on the one hand, as the attacker, my goal is to cause as much pain to you as possible to try and get you to pay up. And on the other hand, if I'm going to exfiltrate and steal information, I want that to be information that you would be horrified to have out in public notice, and that could cause you significant harm if it were put out in the public. Databases tend to fit those categories. They tend to be business critical. They have lots of information, especially lots of personal data, so that a breach of that data can be quite costly just in and of itself. And so they're great targets. And now, if I'm going to steal a database, then I have to hope that the database I'm stealing is usable. And in terms of ransomware, my way of making your data unusable to you is to encrypt it and not give you the encryption key. In terms of defense, my way of keeping that data of being usable to you as the attacker is to encrypt it and not let you steal the key. So Rachel, I agree, multi-factor authentication, really, really critical. But from a database standpoint, I think encryption is possibly just as important. And it's really a basic control. But I will tell you this, whenever I'm talking to someone about this particular part of ransomware exfiltration, I always sort of preface it with, but you should be encrypting anyway. You probably have some due care requirement to protect that data outside of ransomware. And as long as you're doing that properly and not sticking, as we've so often seen, sticking the encryption keys on the same server as the encrypted data, as long as you're not doing something like that, you're probably in pretty good shape. The bad things that we see are the people who aren't encrypted yet because the message hasn't got out, or the people who are encrypted but haven't really thought through key management properly.
Yeah, Russ, I completely agree with you. I mean, one of the other critical controls we talk about is, it kind of goes hand in hand with incident response, is the backup. right?
Yeah.
Secure, offsite, encrypted. I mean,
Yep.
in the early days of the pandemic, when these attacks started happening, we were finding clients say, well, I have a backup. I'm like, great, where is it? On the same system that's encrypted now by the ransomware. It's like, well, that's really helpful. and it's, but it,
Oops.
nobody had to ever think about that before. And so, but you're exactly right. Encryption is so important.
Yeah, and I love the fact that there is some irony in that you can turn encryption back on the attacker, right? They're going to try to encrypt your system to make it unavailable. But if in turn you beat them to the punch and encrypted it, they really cannot exfiltrate the data, or it won't be meaningful to them if they do exfiltrate it, put it that way. So that's a good point. Well, and Bridget mentioned the word move laterally. And that's one reason I wanted to really have Philip on to talk about, in this, a lot of this unfortunately is about if you do, if an attack is successful, how do you limit the amount of success of that attack and limit the damages therefore associated with it? So Philip, maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of some best practices on how to limit lateral movement for malware, ransomware malware.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. And I'm actually going to take a step back because Rachel mentioned a few things I thought, perfect demonstration. The analogy of walking down the cyber alley and being able to look into people's windows and doors. It's because we're basically nowadays building everything on the public internet because it's the ubiquitous network. And fundamentally, we just give it public IPs and like, yeah, go nuts. Our CISO recently stood up a server in a public cloud, and then within something like 23 hours, it had 17,500 attempted connections from unique IP addresses. And it's kind of, if you look at the top two, at least at the moment from the latest thing I read, the top two attack vectors for ransomware to initially get in, CV exploit and RDP brute force, two things that come functionally from the fact that we have public IP addresses. And as Rachel said, we're not doing effective patch management and stuff like that. So what we're really pushing in our educational story is how we can build private zero trust. And I like to think of private zero trust, it's almost like MFA on steroids, but even further. If you can embed private connectivity into an application, into a database based upon embedded identity, which means things can communicate over the public internet, but not have a public IP address, where it effectively cannot, literally impossible to possible to do an external network level attack. So DDoS, CV exploit, port scanning, brute force, these things become impossible. But then to your point, you can also set up application microsegmentation and least privilege access. So even if somehow someone did get access to the environment, they can't just get access to everything. We do this using an open source technology, which we're the creator of, called OpenZT. And OpenZT is effectively a suite of SDKs, which you can put in your app, or you can put in your operating system, or you can put in your data center or cloud environment. And one of the really interesting things we've done recently, we've actually taken those SDKs and we've put them into JDBC and ODBC. That's high level. It's like the API to access your database. So now you can put private zero trust in your WebLogic server, and you can put it in your access point for an SQL developer. And you can say, well, Mr. SQL developer, you can only get access to the specific resources. And those resources, even though you're going over the internet, even though you're working from home, completely unaddressable. Hackers can't get to it in the first place. But then even if somehow your device does get compromised, but as Rachel was saying, hopefully you've got endpoint management, which then provides a feedback loop to make sure you get cut off from the overlay, you cannot access other resources. So you cannot pivot and SSH into a machine, or do SCP, or some other access to resources, so that you massively reduce the attack surface initially. But then even if somehow does compromise and get a foothold somewhere, it's so much more difficult for them to pivot and move and migrate, and therefore be able to cause wider damage across the business. I like to think, because technology is never the answer. Technology is a means in which we implement policy and control. And it's almost that bridge between what Rachel was talking about, how we have those controls and then how we implement that in a completely seamless way so that high security becomes easy.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Philip. So thank you for that. So yeah, I think, again, as we can all see, there's layers of approach. And I think that's what all of us are talking about. Unfortunately, if this was a simple fix, it wouldn't be in the news, right? And as we continue to evolve our defenses, well, they continue to evolve their attacks. And so speaking of that, Rachel, I'm going to come back at you with a question that we have that someone posed. So I'll read their question real quick. Do you see the brokers, are you seeing the brokers move from a questionnaire approach, therefore an honor system based approach, to an actual audit of security infrastructure, therefore looking under the hood, if you will, to assess the risk and therefore the associated premiums for that risk?
So going back to my original premise, which is we are an ancient industry, one which is on our walker, there will always be an application of some kind, whether it be via something in written form. Admittedly, most of them are electronically submitted now, or if it's delivered via an underwriting meeting. I do think that there is an opportunity to evolve this landscape with respect to how do our clients demonstrate to the underwriting community their cybersecurity controls. And that's effectively what we're trying to do here. The underwriters need to get a better understanding. The challenge they've been facing in the last 12 to 18 months is, insurance is based upon the ability to predict losses actuarially, right? So I got to be able to predict it as an underwriter. And then I can say, okay, then I can differentiate between insureds, the good, the bad, and the middle, right? And from there, then I can determine how much capital do I want to deploy in the way of aggregate limit, how much retention do I want that client to retain, their deductible, and then how much rate do I charge them? Right now, the rates are doing this because before March of 2020, the underwriters, as I mentioned, they weren't charging enough money for all the losses that they're paying now. So they have to find a new baseline. And that's the challenge we're running into right now is there is no differentiation. It's just everybody's paying more. That's it. Where we are seeing some differentiation though, and why it's so important to do these assessments, if you will, or applications, is that if you can demonstrate your cyber hygiene is rather hardened, meaning you have all of these controls, then we as your broker are in a better position to advocate and negotiate broader coverage. And that's what it's really down to right now is whether or not, as I mentioned earlier, whether or not we can get you the coverage. Because the underwriters have said, I am simply no longer willing to underwrite a risk that doesn't have the minimum requirements needed to protect themselves. It's no different than, some of the things I try to draw parallels to the grandpas and the grandmas of insurance, property, for example. You can't get property insurance if you don't have proper COPE information, okay? Like if you don't have sprinkler systems, insurers are not going to give you property insurance, at least not meaningful coverage with broad coverages to cover actual losses. It's the same thing here. What's difficult for most of our clients is this has turned on a dime. It's flipped overnight. And what we keep telling the underwriters is you need to take a page from your property underwriter's playbook, which is give me a list of 5 recommendations that I can do in the next 12 months so that I have a path forward to get better coverage and hopefully maybe better rates. The underwriters aren't even doing that. They're just saying, do all of this. And I don't care how much it costs you to implement it. And it's like, that's ridiculous. That's not how insurance works. So unfortunately, yes, you are going to have to continue to do an application depending upon how sophisticated your information security team and your IT sort of architecture team are. There might be an opportunity to get them on the phone with underwriters, similar to kind of like an earnings call where your C-suite gets on the phone and sort of talks about the business. This is their opportunity to do that as well.
Yeah, no, that I couldn't agree with you more. And Bridget, I'm going to let you tag onto that because I know you talked about the importance of third-party assessments. And for those of us that are going to be impacted by CMMC, Now those assessments are required by third parties, just like PCI assessments are for the payment card industry. So we're seeing this evolution where in answer to the, to add on to the question that was being posed, is the honor system going away, if you will, or the self-assessments and more of the third-party assessments? So Bridget, let me toss that over to you because I know y'all do a lot of.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest asks we have, so, to piggyback on Rachel's last points, is what we're seeing at Booz Allen is a lot of our large enterprise clients are coming to us and saying, we don't understand. What do they want from us? Why are our rates going up so much? What can we do to prevent it? Can you help? And what we recommend is we do like a ransomware readiness assessment where we take the key controls, many of which Rachel went through, and we actually do the work. We get under the hood, we look inside, we rate them, we'll build a pathway to maturity. We will reconfigure, for example, we'll look at if they have an EDR solution and a SOC, we'll look how good that SOC is. We will look at their data at rest to make sure it's encrypted. We will do all those sort of things that would build a layered defense, particularly to this ransomware risk, which I think is really the biggest risk within cyber. Other than like an insider threat, or probably more than an insider threat, that large companies have to face. So we're seeing an uptick in that, and we're seeing that when you have the assessment and you get some consulting services, it's done for you. So you can take that to the board of directors and say, if you're a CISO, listen, Booz Allen said, our carrier saying, we need this. Booz Allen said we need to configure this, and this. Here's the budget we need to do it. And you don't have to point too far in the news to say, hey, look at JBS, Colonial Pipeline, you name it, and you'll find that they'll start listening. It's front page news now. So I find that's the useful way to use an assessment. I don't think. I think if you are a small company, a great thing a lot of the brokers have free assessments. I think Marsh has a small business program that offers a free assessment. I think also your insurance application is a mini assessment. They're going to ask you about all your controls that would lead to a ransomware attack. And you have to ask yourself, okay, why are they asking these questions, and do I have these controls? So those are some of the things to think about if you're a small business or a business on a budget. How do I get an assessment, and how do I level set what I need? So there's a lot out there. You just have to seek it out, build a plan, and budget accordingly.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And I know Bridget, on the last webinar, you brought up, there's even the CISA, right? They have assessments, and we talked about that in the assessment webinar. But the U.S. government provides complimentary assessment scripts and other things that you can utilize to help assess your environment. Where I would say, I think another big benefit is, look, budget is always an issue, whether it's just to budget for people's time and effort, if this is going to be more policy based, or whether it's you're going to add some automated technology controls, et cetera. I think a big part of it is positioning it in a way to executives that they truly get it, if you will. They understand what the impact to their organization could be. A lot of them, it's not that they're not keeping up with ransomware. I mean, if you read the Wall Street Journal, it's hard not to keep up with it. But I think a lot of them don't understand that these attackers will lay in wait and they'll hit you at the worst opportune time, and in many cases. And they're very smart about that. They know we're coming right up on Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And I don't think it would be prudent to not mention there are going to be organizations that are already infiltrated, and the attackers are going to wait to hit you over the Thanksgiving holiday. Because I know for many retailers, if they miss that weekend or week of sales leading up to Christmas, it can be catastrophic. And, you know, and it's, I didn't realize this, the 3 days following Thanksgiving, the airline industry books like an unbelievable percentage of their tickets. It's the highest booking weekend for airlines, I guess, because people have time to sit down and plan out their vacations and et cetera. So, you know, just be aware of that. And again, leverage third parties like Booz and Marsh, et cetera, to help your executives understand what the impact could be. So that's one reason I'm so grateful to have y'all on here. So let me transition back over to you, Russ. I know a lot of companies, you know, speaking of this, they say, hey, we've already got some controls like disk encryption, or maybe network controls to monitor, you know, data leaving the environment, et cetera. And, you know, I wanted to get your thoughts on what are your observed best practices around, you know, being able to, you know, we understand, I think one thing that's lost on customers is that, you know, Colonial Pipeline and JBS and a lot of these other organizations that are hit with these attacks, they had controls as well, right? And so I just wanted to toss it over to you and see if you have, what are your observations that you've done around that from a ransomware perspective?
I think it boils down to the same thing that we've all seen in this industry for years. Whenever you're assessing a control, you have to assess whether the control is fit for purpose or not. And just because I have a control does not mean that control does anything to address the purpose that I'm looking at. You'd mentioned disk encryption. Normally, we think of disk encryption as a control to address the risk of a disk being sent back to a manufacturer with data on it and data leakage through that path. When installed in the SAN, disk encryption does nothing to prevent somebody with logical access to the data from simply extracting the data. If you think in terms of firewalls, absolutely. I mean, who would be insane enough to run without firewalls? But is there anybody who doesn't have firewalls? You can't count on that altogether. So whenever I'm advising one of my clients in this area, I do like to start with what is the risk that you're addressing, and what is the control that you think is addressing that risk, and does that actually suit your purpose or not? A really, really unfortunate amount of times, and I would bet Bridget working for Booz Allen has seen this, a really, really unfortunate amount of times, it's a control that somebody put in mind, maybe something that somebody sold them, maybe something that was the right answer 20 years ago, but it's not the right answer now.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think the other common mistake I see, Russ, is a one size fits all. You know, people will go, oh, well, I can't do this control across my entire environment. I don't think anybody that is sincere would advocate that necessarily. You know, I think you have to understand the criticality of the system and the level of sensitivity of the data that you're dealing with. Those combined will give you guidance on the level of controls that you need to protect it. Wouldn't you agree?
I'm of two minds on this one, Ted. I'd be interested in Rachel's opinion too. There are some controls that I think need to be applied across the system, because any entry point gives me a platform on which to land and try and move laterally. So Rachel had brought up MFA before. You could make a good argument MFA should be there for every single privileged logon.
Yeah, good
but
point.
Let's talk about maybe the other MFA, multi-factor authorization, where you tend to set up things like trusted path to data. Those controls tend to be somewhat expensive, both in terms of the technology and in terms of the implementation cost. And there, I think you've got to take a risk-based approach to when you implement those and when you don't. Now, one thing that I wish I had, and I've just never sat down and thought about doing it, is which is which, right? Which controls should be risk-based, which controls should be everywhere? Maybe one of the other panelists has thought on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
Well, I mean, I think Russ is on to something here, and we always, I'm a simple woman. Okay, I don't believe in overcomplicating things, and I have clients of all shapes and sizes and deep sophistication, and some who just sort of scrape the surface. So we try to keep our questions simple, which is, do you know what data you have, and do you know where it's stored? Just asking that question blows their mind usually, and that can keep us absorbed for a year. But honestly, that's probably the first question you need to ask, because then, to Russ's point, then we can, if we can figure out where all the skeletons are, then we can figure out which skeletons are the most important to us, right? Because that's really the fundamental issue is, okay, do I really need MFA on this thing here, which is for all intents and purposes like a sales and marketing database, versus here's my customer database with all their financial information. Maybe that's important. Yeah. So maybe that's something I want to really have the lock and key on pretty sturdy. But I think that's where I start is, let's understand the data, let's understand where it is, and then we have to ask the client the next question, which is, can be up for a lot of debate, which is, okay, what's important and what isn't?
Yeah.
Who's willing to stick their neck out to be the one to say what's not important? And that's where we found the biggest conflict internally at clients.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And yeah, well said. I think there are controls. I agree with you after thinking about it, Russ. I think some controls would be, make sense to be consistent, like MFA, but we also talk about, zero trust. And I can tell you my experience for organizations, start with your very most critical systems and see if you can accomplish zero trust for those, because that's such a large effort for most organizations that I think trying to tackle all of their systems to be zero trust would be a tall order for them. So it's also kind of getting started somewhere too. But so
yeah, I was gonna say I fully agree with that, and it goes back to what Rachel was saying on the assessment of system or application or database perspective, where are the most critical ones. I can tell you internal examples from our organization. Our CRM, we just use open internet with password and then MFA. Our internal documenting system, similar. Our development environment, where we build our own platform, that's completely invisible, private, zero trust, no public IPs. We know every single person has access to it because it's based upon our embedded identity system. Therefore, it's super tight and super controlled. Simultaneously, how we maintain our infrastructure and how we patch our systems, again, similar. Funny story. When we started building our patching system a few years ago, we used a technology which had a massive CVE, and we were kind of testing at the time, our master got hacked. We went, ooh, that's not good. So we spent a year re-engineering our system so that our own technology is embedded in the patching system within our own technology so that it's not exposed to the public internet at all. And therefore, you're able to apply the best security to the systems which are most important. Simultaneously, we use a tool called Mattermost. It's an open source version of Slack. But again, we've applied the same principles of zero trust to it. So I can access it, but I could give you the same URL. You will not be able to resolve to it. You will not be able to access it because it doesn't have a public IP. There was it's lower down on the list of threats, but there actually was an organization that got compromised and ransomwared a few months ago because someone managed to steal a cookie from a collaboration tool. They signed in to their tool as the malicious actor, and they opened a support ticket and said, "Oh, I've lost my password. Can you please replace it?" And they sent it once, and then they got in the environment, they escalated their privilege, and they were able to get access to the solution. Yeah, and we design our own internal system, so that's not possible at all.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I know we're coming up on our time, and I'm gonna go in reverse order this time from what we did at the opening to just gather y'all's your summary or closing comments based on the discussion today and the topic of data exfiltration. So Russ, I'm gonna start with you to maybe share what your final thoughts are or recommendations are for organizations dealing with this issue.
Since I get to go first, I'm going to do the obvious one. The threat is real. The requirement is real. Doing nothing is not something you can afford to do. So follow a common sense approach. Assess your systems for security, know where your sensitive data is, and begin to apply, at a minimum, common sense precautions to protect that data.
Now, excellent. Well stated. So I appreciate that. So Philip, let me throw it over to you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, building upon that, once you have an idea of what those systems, those applications are, while it can seem daunting to implement some of the technologies to get started, it doesn't have to be. You can start with literally just one application, one database, the most important one, and you don't even have to buy a commercial product. There are open source solutions like OpenZT. There are companies like NetFoundry that provide enterprise versions of it so that you can just secure that. You can secure just your initial use case, and you can build a roadmap that enables you to, in the future, close all inbound ports, to stop network level attacks, to stop the lateral movement. But it starts by having the journey and being able to map out and apply to it.
Oh, excellent. Appreciate that. So, so Rachel, I'm going to throw it over to you next. What are your parting thoughts for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got plenty of technical experts on the line, so I won't drill down to those. But what I would suggest is that everybody on the line today connect with your risk management team. There needs to be a better coordination of stakeholders across organizations, because when one of these instances happen, whether it just be a good old-fashioned privacy breach or an actual hair-on-fire ransomware attack, there needs to be better collaboration internally. That's the best path to success in being able to respond effectively to these instances. And what I will tell you is there's actually a fair amount of resources that the insurance companies are providing within their policies. There's access to resources at a discounted rate. So some of these firms that we've talked about and some of these tools we've talked about, and they are also helping clients with those assessments, as are we as a broker. But that's what I would say. I would leave everyone with: more collaboration will lead to a better response.
Yeah, excellent. So thank you for that, Rachel. And I agree with you about leveraging. You need to leverage all of your IT vendors, your insurance companies, your brokers, and firstly, probably your advisors. So Bridget, I'm going to throw it over to you for your closing comments.
Yeah, and it's I think a layered defense is important, much like all the other panelists discussed. I think also, to piggyback off of what Rachel said, being prepared is going to be key, because a layered defense is great, but what happens when your defenses fail? Because human error, for example, we talk about EDR as some silver bullet, but what if someone turns down or misses a notification? These things do happen. In fact, they happen quite a bit. Or what if you have a persistent attacker, right? That these things happen. What do you do in those circumstances? So be prepared, assume it's going to happen to you, start from that negative place, and figure out what operational steps are you going to take to manage the crisis, and to build a plan to not pay and respond to the exfiltration event.
Yeah, exactly. So, my personal closing thought as the host and moderator is, first of all, thank you to all of our panelists. We really appreciate it. It's very kind of you to do this. And I think the net message is leverage your resources, leverage your IT vendors, leverage the brokers, just like Rachel. I think everybody saw a lot of the value they can bring. Leverage the insurance providers, and of course, leverage the advisors. people like Bridget and Rachel, et cetera, they're dealing day in and day out with organizations that have been on the bad side of this, right? And there's a lot of lessons learned that you can learn from that. So again, really thank you to the panelists. Everybody offered their time complimentary, and we're very grateful for that. So let me make a quick plug for tomorrow's session. Again, we are going to open and close with Gartner tomorrow. We will not record that section. It's against Gartner's policy to record their analyst speaking. So tomorrow's session with Gartner will not be recorded. So, and you really want to hear from Nick Simpson. He's out of Europe. He wrote 3 papers this year on the importance of availability with respect to ransomware and how those attacks are evolving. And again, the only way you're going to be able to hear that is live. So hope you can attend that tomorrow. He will open and close the session for us tomorrow. And then in addition to that, we have Veeam is going to be participating. They're the leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for backup and availability solutions. So, and of course, most importantly, we'll have Bridget back with us tomorrow. So Bridget will be here. And then Philip from NetFoundry will be back. And then we'll have Brian Grin from Oracle with us as well. So it's a packed agenda for Oracle for the webinar tomorrow, and really looking forward to having everybody. The availability issue is, it's a difficult one to overcome and be resilient to. And I think that's the key. And I think you'll hear a lot of best practices, some very specific recommendations on what to do, as well as hearing Nick talk about how the evolution of these attacks are really making it important to get on top of them from an availability standpoint. So with that said, I want to thank everybody for their time, and especially to our panelists for their contributions today, and look forward to seeing everybody for our final webinar tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everyone.